Tonight was his engagement, a night that should have been one of celebration, of excitement. Instead, he felt like a guest at his own event, watching his life being signed away in an agreement he had no part in making. His father, Robert Montgomery, stood beside him, a firm hand on his shoulder. "Smile, son. You're about to secure the most important deal of your life." Victor clenched his jaw, forcing himself to nod. This wasn't about love. It never had been. In the world he was born into, marriage was just another form of business. Alliances, connections, power. And tonight, he was being bound to a woman he had never met. The only thing he knew about her? She was simple. That's what his mother had kept repeating every time the topic was brought up. "She's a simple girl, Victor. No arrogance, no greed. She will be the perfect wife for you." Victor wasn't sure what that meant, but he didn't bother arguing. He had stopped fighting against his parents' plans long ago. Across the massive ballroom, he spotted her standing quietly near the fireplace. The woman he was about to marry, Sophia Carter. She looked ordinary. Nothing striking, nothing that commanded attention like the women he was used to. Her dress was elegant but understated, a soft blue that contrasted against her fair skin. Her long dark hair cascaded in soft waves, and she stood with a posture that neither screamed confidence nor submission, just stillness. Victor exhaled, adjusting his cufflinks. This was it. This was his future. As he approached her, she looked up. Their eyes met, and for a fleeting moment, something flickered in her gaze, something unreadable. But before he could dwell on it, she smiled. "Mr. Montgomery," she greeted, her voice calm, measured. Victor studied her. No nervousness, no excitement, just control. "Victor?" he corrected, extending his hand. She hesitated for half a second before placing her hand in his. "Sophia," she returned. The warmth of her touch sent an unexpected jolt through him. He dismissed it immediately. This wasn't about feelings. This was about duty. "Shall we?" he asked, motioning towards the crowd waiting for their official introduction. She nodded. "Let's give them what they want." Something about the way she said it made his stomach tighten. The engagement ceremony went by in a blur. Rings exchanged, speeches given, glasses raised. But through it all, Victor couldn't shake off the unsettling feeling creeping up his spine. There was something about Sophia, something off. He had expected a shy, naive girl, someone overwhelmed by wealth and status, someone eager to please. But Sophia was different. She moved through the event effortlessly, speaking with poise, her presence subtle yet commanding. She wasn't intimidated by the attention. If anything, she seemed to own it. Victor watched her carefully. Who exactly had he just agreed to marry? The wedding night. The grand suite was filled with soft candlelight, the air carrying the faint scent of roses and expensive perfume. Victor loosened his tie, exhaling slowly. He should have been relieved that the exhausting wedding festivities were over. Instead, he felt restless. Sophia stood near the vanity, her hands delicately removing the earrings from her ears. Her reflection met his in the mirror. "You've been watching me all night," she said, her tone even. Victor didn't deny it. "You're not what I expected." She let out a soft chuckle, setting down the jewelry. "And what exactly did you expect? A simple girl." She turned to face him fully now, amusement flickering in her gaze. "And do I seem simple to you?" Victor took a slow step forward. "No." A silence stretched between them. The warmth in the room suddenly felt heavy, charged. Then Sophia exhaled, her expression shifting. "Victor," she said softly, "there's something I need to tell you." His pulse quickened. She hesitated, then took a step closer. "I haven't been completely honest with you." Victor's body tensed. "What do you mean?" She looked up at him, her eyes searching his, as if trying to gauge whether he was ready for the truth. And then she finally said it. "I'm not who you think I am." The words sent a sharp chill through him. Sophia swallowed hard, her fingers tightening into fists. "My real name isn't Sophia Carter, and I didn't come from a small, quiet life like your family believes." Victor felt a cold wave of uncertainty settle over him. "Then who are you?" he asked, his voice controlled. but his heart pounding. She took a deep breath, and then she told him a truth so shocking, so deeply buried in history, that it would change everything. Victor's entire world was about to turn upside down. Victor's breath hitched. The way Sophia stood there, steady yet vulnerable, sent a ripple of unease through him. "I'm not who you think I am." The words lingered in the air like an unshaken storm. His fingers curled at his sides. "Then who are you?" he repeated, his voice sharp, controlled. Sophia exhaled, her chest rising and falling as if she had carried this weight for too long. "My real name is Isabella Romano." Victor's entire body stiffened. Romano. The name hit him like a slap to the face. A name he hadn't heard in years. A name that was never spoken in the Montgomery household. A name that once held power, wealth, and an empire that no longer existed. His breath came out slow, measured. "Romano," he echoed, testing the weight of it on his tongue. "Sophia, no," Isabella nodded. "You've heard of my family." Victor swallowed. He didn't just hear about them. He had grown up knowing exactly who they were. The Romanos were once among the most powerful financial dynasties in the country. Their influence stretched across continents, their businesses thriving, until one night everything changed. They disappeared. A sudden, brutal downfall. One day, they were untouchable. The next, their name was erased from the world of power. And now the last living heir was standing in front of him. His wife. Victor's mind spun. "That's impossible," he said, his voice laced with disbelief. "The Romanos were destroyed?" Isabella finished for him. Her lips curled into a bitter smile. "Yes, but not all of us." Victor's stomach twisted. "How?" he asked, his voice quieter now, as if the walls could hear. "How did you survive?" She hesitated. "My father knew something was coming. He tried to fight it, but he was outnumbered. They took everything from us. Everything except me." Victor's jaw clenched. "Who?" Her eyes flickered with something dark. "The Montgomerys." Silence crashed between them. Victor felt his breath leave him. Number it couldn't be. His family? Isabella took another slow step toward him. "Your father, Victor," she said softly. "Your father led the charge against mine. He didn't just destroy my family. He made sure no one would ever remember the Romanos again." Victor's fingers twitched at his sides. His father. Robert Montgomery, the man who had built their empire, the man Victor had spent his entire life trying to live up to. He had always known his father was ruthless, cutthroat, but this, Victor's throat was dry. "You married me knowing all of this?" Isabella's lips parted, her breath uneven. "I married you because I didn't have a choice." Victor's world tilted. "What does that mean?" She looked away for a second, something unreadable passing through her eyes. When she met his gaze again, her expression was filled with something raw, something painful. "It means I didn't come into this marriage just to be your wife," she whispered. "I came here to take back what was stolen from me." Victor's entire body tensed. A cold realization settled in his chest. His wife wasn't just an innocent girl from nowhere. She was a woman with a mission that somehow involved him. The floor beneath him seemed unsteady. His world, the world he had always believed was unshakable, was suddenly crumbling. And the woman responsible for it was standing right in front of him. Victor stared at her, his heart hammering inside his chest. His entire life, his family, his legacy, was suddenly a tangled mess of lies, buried secrets, and the woman standing in front of him. "You came here to take back what was stolen from you," he repeated, his voice eerily calm, masking the storm inside him. "And what exactly does that mean, Isabella?" She didn't flinch at the use of her real name. If anything, she seemed relieved. "It means," she said slowly, "that my marriage to you wasn't just about you. It was about the Montgomery Empire." Victor let out a short, bitter laugh. "So, what? This was a long con. You pretended to be the perfect bride so you could infiltrate my family and destroy everything from the inside." Isabella's jaw tightened. "It's not that simple, Victor. Isn't it?" His voice was sharper now, colder. He took a step closer, towering over her, but she didn't shrink away. "You lied to me. You played me." His eyes narrowed. "Or are you going to tell me you fell in love with me along the way?" Silence. For the first time, she looked uncertain. Victor exhaled sharply, stepping back as realization dawned. "You did," he whispered, shaking his head. "You didn't expect to care, did you?" Isabella clenched her fists. "None of this was supposed to happen," she admitted. "I was supposed to come here, gain your family's trust, and make them pay." Victor felt his chest tighten. "By doing what? Destroying me too?" Her lips parted, but she said nothing. His stomach twisted. "You never planned to tell me the truth, did you?" She swallowed hard. "I wanted to," she said softly, "but how could I? Your father ruined my life, Victor. He took everything from me. I wanted justice." Victor's blood ran cold. "Justice?" His hands curled into fists. "And what does justice look like to you, Isabella?" His voice was dangerously low. "Were you planning to expose my family, bring my father down, or," he paused, his mind spinning, "or were you planning something else?" Her silence was his answer. Victor inhaled sharply. "Tell me the truth." His voice was like steel. "How far were you willing to go?" Isabella finally met his gaze, and for the first time, she looked afraid, but not for herself, for him. Victor's stomach dropped. "Isabella," his voice was hoarse now, barely above a whisper. "What did you do?" A sharp knock on the door made them both freeze. 3 short raps, precise, measured. Victor's body tensed. His instincts screamed that something was very wrong. Before he could react, the door swung open, and standing there, flanked by 2 men in dark suits, was his father. Robert Montgomery's expression was unreadable as his cold gaze flickered between them. He stepped into the room, adjusting the cuffs of his perfectly tailored suit. "Well," he said smoothly, his voice a dangerous purr, "this is quite the wedding night revelation, isn't it?" Isabella's entire body went rigid. Victor's jaw clenched. "Dad," he said slowly, "what are you doing here?" His father smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I could ask you the same thing, son, but the more important question is..." His gaze settled on Isabella, and for the first time, Victor saw something dark beneath his father's usual composure. "How long did you think you could fool us, Isabella Romano?" Her breath hitched. Victor felt the ground beneath him shift. His father knew. Before Victor could process what that meant, Robert turned to his men. "Take her!" Everything happened in a blur. The guards moved toward Isabella. She gasped, stepping back, her eyes darting to Victor. And in that moment, something inside him snapped. Victor lunged forward, his instincts overriding logic. "Don't touch her!" One of the guards grabbed Isabella's arm. She fought back, but they were stronger. Victor grabbed the man by the collar, yanking him away from her. Robert sighed, shaking his head. "Son, don't be foolish." Victor ignored him, his chest heaving as he stood between Isabella and the guards. His father's men hesitated, waiting for Robert's command. Robert studied his son for a long, tense moment. Then he let out a slow breath, disappointment flickering in his gaze. "So, this is what it comes to," he murmured. "My own son, standing against me, over her." Victor's jaw tightened. "I don't know what game you're playing, Dad, but this ends now." Robert tilted his head slightly. "Does it?" Before Victor could react, his father pulled something from his jacket. Something small, something metallic, a gun. Victor barely had time to process it before a gunshot rang out. Isabella screamed. Victor stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat as pain exploded through his shoulder. His vision blurred, the world tilting as he collapsed to the floor. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him whole was Isabella's terrified face as his father turned the gun toward her. A sharp, searing pain ripped through Victor's shoulder as he gasped, his body hitting the cold marble floor. The sound of Isabella's scream barely registered through the ringing in his ears. Blood, warm, thick, pooling beneath him. His father had shot him. Robert Montgomery stood over him, gun still raised, his expression as calm as ever. "You disappoint me, son," he said flatly, as if this was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Victor's vision blurred, but his instinct screamed at him. Move! Now he tried to push himself up, his arm trembling from the wound. Isabella was struggling against the guards, her eyes wild with terror. Let him go, she cried, but Robert didn't even spare her a glance. You should have never come back, Isabella, Robert said, his voice ice cold. You should have stayed dead. She stopped struggling, her breath hitching, and for the first time, Victor saw something in her face he hadn't seen before. Fear, real, raw fear. Not for herself, for him. His father took a slow step forward, pointing the gun directly at her now. Did you really think you could win? He asked, his voice calm, almost amused. That you could slip into my family and bring us down from the inside? He tisked. You were never as smart as your father. Victor's stomach twisted. His father had no intention of letting Isabella leave this room alive. Number. Adrenaline surged through his veins. Gritting his teeth against the pain, he lunged. Robert barely had time to react before Victor slammed into him, knocking the gun from his grip. It skidded across the floor, spinning out of reach. Get Isabella out of here, Victor shouted, his voice hoarse. The guards hesitated, caught off guard. Isabella didn't. She twisted free from their grip and grabbed a heavy crystal vase from the table, smashing it against one of the guards' heads. He crumpled instantly. The second guard lunged for her, but she ducked, spinning out of reach. Victor tried to fight off his father, but Robert was stronger, pinning him down. You're making a mistake, Victor, Robert hissed, gripping his injured shoulder, sending a fresh wave of agony through him. Victor gritted his teeth. So did you. With the last of his strength, he wrenched free, throwing a brutal punch to his father's jaw. Robert stumbled back, dazed. Isabella grabbed Victor's arm, pulling him toward the door. Come on! He staggered to his feet, his vision swimming. The pain was unbearable, but he pushed through it. They bolted through the doorway just as more guards appeared at the end of the hall. Isabella yanked open a side door. This way! Victor followed, barely staying upright. Footsteps pounded behind them. Find them! Robert's furious voice echoed through the halls. They sprinted through a dimly lit corridor, bursting into the back gardens. A sleek black car was parked at the edge of the estate. Isabella yanked open the door. Get in! Victor collapsed into the seat, his hand pressing against his bleeding shoulder. Isabella slid into the driver's seat and floored the gas. The tires screeched as they tore down the long driveway. In the rearview mirror, Victor saw figures pouring out of the mansion. Robert stood at the top of the steps, his face dark with fury, but he didn't chase them because he didn't need to. Victor knew what his father was capable of. This wasn't over, not even close. As the estate faded into the distance, he turned to Isabella, his breathing ragged. You should have told me, he rasped. She gripped the wheel, her knuckles white. Would you have believed me? Victor clenched his jaw. He didn't know. Maybe, maybe not. But none of that mattered now. They had just declared war on Robert Montgomery, and Victor had no doubt his father would strike back. Hard. Victor's breathing was ragged. His body slumped against the car seat as Isabella sped through the darkened roads. The pain in his shoulder was excruciating, but the adrenaline pumping through his veins kept him alert. His mind, however, was a battlefield. His father had shot him, not just threatened, not just warned, but actually pulled the trigger. It wasn't just about Isabella anymore. It was about control, about power, about sending a message. Robert Montgomery had always believed himself untouchable, and tonight, Victor had done the unthinkable. He had defied him. Where are we going? He asked, his voice hoarse. Somewhere safe, Isabella muttered, gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Victor let out a sharp, bitter chuckle. There's no such thing anymore. Isabella's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. They both knew the truth. His father had resources, connections, men who would hunt them down no matter where they ran. They weren't just running from Robert Montgomery. They were running from an entire empire. The car screeched to a stop outside an old abandoned warehouse near the docks. Isabella jumped out, rushing to Victor's side. He groaned as she helped him out of the car, his shoulders screaming in pain. Inside, she urged. Victor staggered forward, his vision blurring. He felt himself slipping, his body weakening. The next thing he knew, he was on the ground. Isabella was kneeling beside him, her hands pressing down on his wound. "Stay with me," she whispered. He let out a weak laugh. "That depends. Are you planning to kill me?" Isabella's eyes flashed with something unreadable. "Don't joke about that." Victor winced as she applied more pressure. "You came into my life with a plan, didn't you? Get close to me. Get inside my family. Tear us apart from within." She didn't deny it. Victor clenched his jaw. "And then what?" he rasped. "Were you going to put a bullet in my head too?" Her expression darkened. "No," she said fiercely. "That was never the plan." "Then what was?" She swallowed hard, struggling to find the words. "I wanted justice. I wanted revenge. But I never wanted this. I never wanted you caught in the middle of it." Victor let out a weak, bitter chuckle. "Well, too late for that now, isn't it?" Isabella didn't answer. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of their breathing. Finally, she whispered, "I never expected to fall in love with you." Victor's breath hitched, his heart hammered against his ribs. Not from pain this time, but from something else entirely. He had spent his entire life surrounded by power, wealth, manipulation. But looking at Isabella now, her face pale, her hands stained with his blood, her eyes filled with a war she had never meant to fight, he realized something. She wasn't just a woman seeking revenge. She was a woman who had lost everything, and now so had he. "Where are we?" he rasped. "A safe house. One of the few places your father doesn't control." Victor exhaled slowly. "So we're alive. That's a start." She didn't smile. Instead, she reached for something on the table beside the bed, a newspaper. She handed it to him without a word. Victor took it, his eyes scanning the headline. "Victor," she whispered, her voice breaking. His vision was starting to fade, his body shutting down from blood loss. But before the darkness fully took him, he forced out the only words that mattered. "We fight back." Then everything went black. 1 week later. Victor's eyes fluttered open. The first thing he registered was the unfamiliar ceiling above him. The second was the dull, aching pain in his shoulder. He tried to sit up, but a hand gently pushed him back down. "Easy," Isabella murmured. He turned his head toward her. She was sitting beside him, dark circles under her eyes, her expression unreadable. "Montgomery Empire in crisis. Robert Montgomery under investigation for illegal business dealings." His breath caught. His father was under federal investigation. He looked up at Isabella, his pulse quickening. "You did this?" She nodded. "Not just me. The truth is coming out, Victor. And once it does, your father's reign is over." Victor's grip tightened on the newspaper. He should have felt relieved. Instead, he felt something else entirely. Because if his father was going down, that meant Victor had to decide what kind of man he was going to be, and whether the war they had started was truly over. This wraps up the story with an open-ended, yet powerful conclusion, setting up future conflicts while giving the audience a satisfying resolution. Let me know if you need any refinements or another story. Victor sat in the dimly lit room, staring at the newspaper in his hands. His father, the man who had built an empire from nothing, who had ruled with an iron fist, was finally on the verge of falling. But something didn't sit right. Isabella had exposed his father's crimes, and yet, Victor knew Robert Montgomery too well. He was a man who always had an escape plan. "They won't be able to touch him," Victor muttered, tossing the newspaper aside. Isabella frowned. "What do you mean?" "The evidence is there. Money laundering, offshore accounts, backdoor deals with politicians." Victor shook his head. "It won't be enough. My father has spent decades buying loyalty. He has people everywhere. Judges, law enforcement, even the media. He'll bury this before it reaches trial." Isabella's face darkened. "Then we need to hit him where it really hurts." Victor looked at her, realization dawning. "His empire." She nodded. "If we can't take him down legally, we dismantle his power from the inside. The companies, the influence, the people who keep him untouchable." Victor exhaled sharply. "That's suicide." "Maybe," Isabella admitted, "but he took everything from me. He left me with nothing. I can't walk away from this." Victor leaned back, his mind racing. For his entire life, he had been trained to continue his father's legacy, to expand the Montgomery Empire. But now he saw what it truly was, a machine built on blood, corruption, and destruction. He couldn't be part of it anymore. And yet, walking away wasn't enough. His father had to pay. Victor's jaw tightened. Then let's finish this. Isabella's breath hitched. I'm done running, he interrupted. My father wants war? He's about to get one. A flicker of something flashed in her eyes. Determination, relief, something deeper. Victor stood, despite the pain in his shoulder. We take his people, his businesses, his contacts. We dismantle him from the inside out. Isabella swallowed. That means going after people who have worked with your family for decades. Are you ready for that? Victor met her gaze. I was raised to be my father's successor. His voice was quiet but strong. Now, I'm going to be his downfall. For the first time, Isabella allowed herself to smile. They weren't just running anymore. They were fighting back, and Robert Montgomery had no idea what was coming for him.